All right. Good morning. I'm Jen Walling, Executive Director of the Illinois Environmental Council, and we're just recording this special interview to talk more about the situation that's happening in Texas with energy and renewable energy, and talk a little bit about Illinois and the same issue. And I have with me Andrew Barbeau, who is a consultant with us, the Accelerate Group. He's an energy expert, knows all about the things that's going on. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it relates to CEJA and how we're going to get CEJA done. So, Andrew, what happened in Texas?
Thanks for having me on. Texas is an interesting case. We saw over the last weekend an unprecedented storm sweep across the state and much of the plains in the United States, leaving ice and layers of ice and cold sweeping across, places normally known for barbecue and outdoor picnics. It was really a challenge for a state that has never been prepared for that. They've had a couple winter storms in the past. 2011, I think, was the last big ice storm that they had, and they seem to have not learned any lessons from it, unfortunately. And that has meant that the people of the state have been left without power for most of the past week, and those who had power being faced in some cases with astronomical electricity bills, paying power providers that caused this problem in the first place.
Yeah, so, a lot of people are blaming this on renewable energy. Is this renewable energy's fault?
Yeah, despite what you've seen on Facebook and on the Hannity show, the renewable energy was not the significant factor here. What primarily happened that we saw was power plants that were never really winterized and fossil fuel infrastructure that was never winterized in Texas failing. We saw coal plants ice over their coal piles and unable to get the coal from the piles into the furnace. We saw gas plants with no walls or insulation in their buildings, literally no walls, and ice coming in and equipment icing over. And we saw gas pipelines freeze because they weren't properly insulated, meaning that the plants could not even get fuel to them to be able to run. That dependency on fossil fuels, that dependency on offsite sources is what caused the vast majority of the problems that lasted for days and days and days, because they had to simply wait for the ice to melt. Out of the grand total, I think there was 30,000 megawatts of generation that was offline because of the freezing. Just the grid operator eventually said, despite first blaming wind, they eventually said that in reality, wind was the least significant factor here. It accounted for about 10 to 15% of the overall outages. If you looked at the next day and the next 2 days, a lot of that wind was back online, outperforming what they were even projecting. So while, despite what you see across the media, this really lays at the feet of the fossil fuel companies that for years have underinvested in those facilities with a principle to get as cheap as possible because they're struggling to compete.
Mm-hmm. So, I know a lot of people were getting a lot of requests. Can this happen in Illinois, and how does our grid work differently?
Yeah, Texas is a unique case in a lot of ways. Our country is made up of 3 electric grids. You have something called the Eastern Interconnection, which is most of what's east of the Rockies, the Western Interconnection, which is everything west of the Rockies, and then Texas. They sit by themselves almost as an island, mostly disconnected from the broader grid, the broader country. And so when they have challenges internally, they have to rely completely internally to solve their own problems. In Illinois, we're connected to 2 multi-state markets, a combination of 27 different states across the transmission organizations that Illinois is part of. In Northern Illinois, that market and grid expands east across several states in the Atlantic, and then in central and southern Illinois, that is part of the MISO grid operator that goes throughout a lot of the Midwest. And so when there are challenges in one part of the system or a weather event hits one part of the system, and it did last week, the rest of the system was able to compensate and make up for that because of the transmission network that we have that moves power around these states. And that's really the vision for the future that we need to be looking at, is how do we expand these networks, these transmission networks? How do we expand our diverse energy sources and incorporate even more renewables on the system, so we're not so dependent on weather malfunctioning equipment of coal and gas plants? And this isn't the first time this happened. Actually, we had a similar event back in 2014 in the first polar vortex, when across the Midwest, coal piles froze and gas plants were not able to get delivery because they went cheap on their contracts and were not guaranteed to get gas delivery in times when there was short supply. So we already faced this once before, and it was close. I think we've learned a lot from them, and looking at how we increase the amount of resources on the grid and not be so dependent on things that rely on fuel.
Yeah, transmission is a huge issue in the Midwest. And I know we're working a lot to address that. So I just wanted to relate this a little bit to the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And there's a lot where we're talking about this Texas system, where in Texas, it's energy on demand, really very, very market-based. And we saw this tragedy happen. And we're kind of on Illinois at the other end in sort of a different like day-to-day tragedy, in that we have a market where we're spending $1.7 billion subsidizing fossil fuels to just stay online, not even produce power, stay online. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's really a tale of two grids here within Texas. You say, depends a lot on the market. I would say it's the free marketer's dream. It really has nobody in charge. There's no one responsible to ensure adequate supply, that there's no planning done locally. And primarily it's left up to, a significant number of marketers that run around and sell kind of energy, buy and sell energy contracts, and, don't really have a vision for the future and a plan for the state. Within Illinois, we're in a kind of completely different end of the spectrum. We're completely dependent now on these grid operators that are in other states to dictate for us what our energy mix is. And that's not good either, right? I mean, right now, as you mentioned, in the Northern Illinois, customers are paying $1.7 billion a year, primarily to fossil fuel plants, just to be around. And buying, and what they frame it as is covering the missing money. It says these coal and gas plants can't produce a profit on their own. They can't be economical on their own. So they need to be there to supply the missing money. That's a bailout. That's plain and simple. That's a bailout that we're already paying $1.7 billion a year for these coal and gas plants. And that's unacceptable. We have to find something in between. We have to be able to design our own destiny that allows us to pursue a clean energy future that reduces our reliance on the fuel-based systems that are risky, as we've seen in natural disasters and emergencies, and rely on stuff that and plan for the future that allows us to achieve the energy supply and the mix and the environmental and health benefits that we want to achieve, and not be constrained or held back by folks out east. And that's simply what we need to be doing more of here in Illinois. We need to be taking more control of how we plan and ensure that we aren't being subjected to a near-term catastrophe like we saw in Texas, or a global catastrophe of climate change. So that's something that we need to address here in Springfield this year.
Yeah. And just bottom lining on that, I think that when we talk about the Clean Energy Jobs Act, one of the things that is essential is this capacity market reform. Because while Texas has this, they're not paying for anything, they're not regulating, we're paying almost 20% of our bills just for capacity. Like the Waukegan coal plant, that is an environmental justice community, solely exists because of capacity payments from the grid. And so I think that, just to get a little controversial here, I think we get a lot of pushback about nuclear subsidies and that sort of thing. But I don't think enough attention is paid to these coal plant subsidies, coal plants and natural gas. That is $1.7 billion. I mean, the Future Energy Jobs Act had $200 million a year in it for the nuclear plants that were in Clinton and the Quad Cities. But every year we just quietly pay 1.7 billion for fossil fuels. We're subsidizing these fossil fuels a huge amount. And that is just a critical portion of being able to clean up our electric grid, is stopping those subsidies. So I think it's really important that when folks are learning about this issue, also learning about the way that we subsidize fossil fuel plants in a way that is really bad for consumers, really bad for the environment, and doesn't help us prevent blackouts and things that happened. So
yeah, I think if people find out that and once they realize that they're paying 20-25% of their bill to go to plants to make up the lost profits of coal and gas plants, and I don't think that they're too excited when they hear about that.
Yeah. I think that's a really important part of CEJA is getting rid of those subsidies. So, and I think that it sets us up to be at a point where, I think like you've outlined, we're really far ahead of Texas in terms of regulators and people overseeing our energy market, which makes us safer. But, also the Clean Energy Jobs Act gives us a lot of new opportunities to bring in a lot more renewable energy, 100% by 2050. So it's really important that we get that bill done this year to make sure that we have control over our electric grid.
Yes. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for this short interview here. And we'll post this later. Thought people could learn a little bit more about Texas and how it relates to Illinois. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.